The road between Boston and the small farming town of Concord looked ordinary in the early spring of 1775, but beneath its quiet surface lay months of tension, anger, and fear. For more than a decade, the relationship between the American colonies and the British Crown had been steadily breaking down. Taxes imposed without colonial consent, laws enforced by distant authority, and the presence of British troops on colonial soil had created a sense that something fundamental had been lost. By the time winter loosened its grip on Massachusetts, the idea of open conflict no longer felt impossible. It felt close. Boston was under British control, effectively an occupied city. General Thomas Gage, the military governor of Massachusetts, commanded thousands of red-coated soldiers stationed there to enforce royal authority. Outside the city, however, control slipped through his fingers. Towns and villages across the countryside had formed local militias, groups of ordinary men who trained part-time and stood ready to defend their communities at a minute's notice. These Minutemen were farmers, blacksmiths, shopkeepers, and laborers, but they were also organized, disciplined, and deeply suspicious of British intentions. British intelligence reported that the colonists were stockpiling weapons and gunpowder in Concord, about 20 miles northwest of Boston. Cannon, muskets, shot, and supplies were said to be hidden in barns and meeting houses. To Gage, this was more than rumor. It was a direct challenge to British authority and a potential threat to his troops. If the colonial militias were allowed to arm themselves freely, any attempt to control Massachusetts would become impossible. On the night of April 18, 1775, General Gage made his move. He ordered Lieutenant Colonel Francis Smith to lead approximately 700 British regulars on a secret march to Concord. Their mission was clear: seize and destroy the military supplies stored there and arrest key rebel leaders if possible. As the smoke settled over the road back to Boston and the wounded were carried into makeshift shelters, the reality of what had happened began to sink in on both sides. For the British command, the march to Concord had turned into a humiliation. A professional army had been harassed, wounded, and driven back by men they had long dismissed as disorganized rebels. For the colonists, the day brought a mix of grief, pride, and determination. Neighbors had been killed, but they had not run. They had stood, fought, and proven something to themselves that could never be forgotten. News of the fighting spread outward with incredible speed. Riders carried the story through Massachusetts and into neighboring colonies. By the evening of April 19, militia units from New Hampshire, Connecticut, and Rhode Island were already beginning to move. Men did not wait for official orders. They responded to rumor, to anger, and to a shared sense that a line had been crossed. What had begun as a local confrontation was becoming something much larger. Inside Boston, General Gage faced an uncomfortable truth. His attempt to quietly suppress colonial resistance had instead exposed the limits of British control. The countryside was effectively hostile territory. British troops could hold the city, but every mile beyond it now seemed dangerous. Worse still, the colonists were no longer just protesting laws. They were fighting. Gage declared martial law and fortified Boston, but his position was weakening. Supplies were limited, and the port could be cut off. Outside the city, thousands of militia began gathering, forming an improvised army that surrounded Boston from land. Camps sprang up along the roads and hills. Farmers slept beside merchants, young men beside veterans of earlier wars. They brought their own weapons, food, and determination. The memory of Lexington weighed heavily on the colonial leaders. The image of men shot down on their own village green became a powerful symbol. It was. In the weeks that followed, the scattered camps surrounding Boston slowly began to resemble an army. Men drilled in open fields, learning to stand in line, load quickly, and fire together. There were shortages of powder, shot, and proper uniforms, but there was no shortage of resolve. Many of these men had marched after hearing the bells on April 19. They still remembered the sound, and it stayed with them as a reminder of why they were there. Leadership became an urgent concern. The militia forces were loyal to their own towns and officers, but a long conflict would require coordination. The Second Continental Congress understood this reality and began to take responsibility for what was now clearly a war effort. In June 1775, they made a decision that would shape the future of the colonies. George Washington, a respected Virginian with military experience, was appointed commander of the Continental Army. His selection sent an important message. This struggle was not just about Massachusetts. It belonged to all the colonies. Washington arrived near Boston to find a difficult situation. The men were brave but undisciplined. Supplies were limited. Records were poorly kept. Yet he also saw something powerful. These soldiers believed in their cause. They were not fighting for pay or glory. They were fighting for their homes and their rights. Washington set about imposing order without crushing spirit, a balance that would define his leadership. The British, meanwhile, prepared to break the siege. Reinforcements arrived by sea, bringing experienced generals and additional troops. Among them were General William Howe, General Henry Clinton, and General John Burgoyne. They assessed the situation and concluded that the colonial forces, though numerous, were vulnerable. A decisive blow might scatter them and restore British control. This belief led directly to the Battle of Bunker Hill in June 1775. Though technically fought after Lexington and Concord, it was shaped entirely. As the year moved forward, the memory of Lexington and Concord remained a steady presence in the minds of both soldiers and civilians. It was spoken of not as a single day of fighting, but as the moment when fear was replaced by commitment. Men who had once debated loyalty and protest now understood that the conflict demanded a choice. The colonies could not return to the world that existed before April 19, 1775. In July, the Continental Congress made one final attempt to avoid complete separation. The Olive Branch Petition was sent to King George III, expressing loyalty while asking for an end to hostilities. Yet even as the document crossed the Atlantic, preparations for war continued. The petition was ultimately rejected, and the king declared the colonies to be in rebellion. That decision closed the last door to compromise. The British evacuation of Boston in March 1776 marked a symbolic victory for the colonial forces. Washington's army, using captured artillery positioned on Dorchester Heights, forced the British fleet to withdraw. Though the war was far from over, the removal of British troops from the city where the conflict had begun felt deeply significant. It was proof that resistance had produced real results. Across the colonies, political thinking evolved rapidly. Pamphlets and speeches argued that independence was no longer radical, but necessary. Thomas Paine's Common Sense, published in early 1776, gave voice to ideas that many already felt but had not yet fully accepted. The logic was simple and direct. A continent should not be ruled by a distant island. Events like Lexington and Concord made that argument feel real rather than theoretical. When the Declaration of Independence was adopted in July 1776, its words echoed the experience of the previous year. Grievances listed on the page were no longer abstract complaints. They were backed by lived experience. Standing armies, military violence, and the denial of self-government were no longer fears.